90. The Crucifixion of the Guilty. Chalcedon Report number 178, June 1980. The writer Frank Harris, 1856 to 1931, had a number of great passions which commanded his time and energies. One was a continuing desire to enslave women sexually. Another was the right to insult and cut down men, especially all waiters. A third was his concern over what he called the crucifixion of the guilty. In his prospectus on his biography of Oscar Wilde, he wrote in part, "The crucifixion of the guilty is still more awe-inspiring than the crucifixion of the innocent. What do we know of innocence?" Life for Harris was the perpetual crucifixion of the guilty, because they were more honest than the supposedly innocent. As a result, Harris was determined to be, quote, honestly and, quote, guilty. In his often fictional autobiography, the impotent old man happily and romantically confessed to endless adulteries, which were, at best, greatly romanticized and extensively fictional. Because he believed that Jesus was a guilty lecher like himself, he identified himself with Jesus, whom he believed to have been crucified by the same, quote, hypocrites, end quote, who assailed Harris. As biographer Philippa Pular stated in Frank Harris, A Biography, 1976, when Harris, at the age of 71, married his mistress Nellie. The belief that he was Jesus was by now so embedded that he recorded in the register that his mother's name was Mary Vernon, confused, no doubt, with Mary the Virgin. Pages 395 and 396. Frank Harris, editor, writer, and member of Parliament, was a noisy but minor figure in his day, but he did give focus more clearly than others to certain major strands of thought, one of which was the vindication of the guilty. With far more sophistication, Émile Durkheim had developed the same philosophy. Durkheim, 1858 to 1917, in the Rules of Sociological Method, 1895, saw crime as a normal part of society, because no society is exempt from it. It is to affirm that it is a factor in public health, an integral part of all healthy societies. The criminal is a necessary part of social evolution. His lawlessness may be social pioneering. It may indicate the next step in social developments. Crime is, then, necessary. It is bound up with the fundamental conditions of all social life, and by that very fact it is useful, because these conditions of which it is a part are themselves indispensable to the normal evolution of morality and law. Page 70, 1938 edition. With such thinking, guilt began to appear as a social asset. True, the influence of Christian thought continued to weigh guilt as liability, but, quote, liberal, end quote, thought saw guilt as a cause to champion. About 10 years ago, a student reported to me that a speaker had declared that it was the presence of lesbians in the women's liberation movement which made it a worthy cause. Feminism in itself he saw as a middle-class matter and nothing to get excited about. As Harris saw it, innocence is a myth. All men are guilty. Freud would have agreed, but not because of the biblical doctrine of sin. Guilt was a product of social hostility by the social cowards against all free spirits. Hence, the crucifixion of the guilty. Clearly, this concept has had a very powerful and pervasive influence on contemporary law. The protection of the guilty is a major cause, whereas the growing persecution of Christians, schools and churches gets almost no attention from the press. The, quote, rights, end quote, of parents are diminished, and the, quote, rights, end quote, of the guilty are stressed and broadened. Going back at least to Lord Byron, literature has shown a morbid interest in the guilty and an impassioned defence of all such. It is a serious mistake to content ourselves with bewailing this doctrine of the crucifixion of the guilty. It is a product of the loss of faith. If Nietzsche is right and God is dead, then good and evil are both myths. And, quote, the guilty, end quote, are wrongfully crucified. Nietzsche, Freud, Dewey, Holmes, and others have acted as though God were dead. The same is true of the Church. It has acted as though God were dead in relation to education, economics, politics, law, and more. As a result, the Word of God has been, quote, dead, end quote, to these areas. If Aris was right, then the so-called guilty are wrongfully, quote, crucified, end quote, and the rightfully guilty are those who apply the outmoded biblical doctrines of good and evil to man. But God is not dead, and the world of Frank Harris and the derelict churches is becoming a growing nightmare. Unless men repent, the Lord who declares, "It is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail," Luke chapter 16, verse 17, will have his time of judgment come upon us.